Today, I am bringing you 9 deeply unsettling accounts from the front lines of America's wilderness, where park rangers have encountered horrors that defy explanation and challenge everything we thought we knew about the natural world. In this compilation, we will journey into the shadows of our national parks with 9 harrowing tales drawn from the experiences of those who patrol the most isolated corners of our forests, canyons, and mountains. Each story has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from ranger reports, witness testimonies, and official documentation that has remained buried in archives for decades. While the core events are authentic, certain identifying details and names have been modified to respect the privacy of those who lived through these terrifying encounters. I applied for a seasonal ranger position at Mount Hood National Forest back in the spring of 2019. Right after finishing my forestry degree at Oregon State. The job posting made it sound pretty straightforward. Patrol the boundary lines, maintain the fencing, document any wildlife activity, and report any encroachments or illegal camping. The pay was decent for seasonal work, and I figured spending a summer in the woods would be a hell of a lot better than sitting in some office cubicle. I was assigned to the eastern boundary section, which according to my supervisor was one of the quieter zones. Most of the tourist traffic stayed near the main trails and campgrounds on the western side, so my section saw maybe a handful of hikers per week. Perfect for someone like me who was not exactly a people person. Jalen, my supervisor, gave me the rundown during my first week. She had been working at Mount Hood for almost 15 years and knew every inch of the place. She walked me through the patrol routes, showed me how to use the GPS mapping system, and explained the reporting procedures. The eastern boundary ran along an old property line that dated back to the early 1900s when the forest was still being parceled out. There was a cemetery out there, she mentioned casually, from one of the original settler families. The Morrison family, I think she said. Most of the graves dated from the 1880s through the 1920s. The cemetery was technically on federal land now, but it was maintained by some historical preservation group that came out once or twice a year to clean it up. I did not think much about the cemetery at first. I'd grown up in rural Oregon, and old pioneer graveyards were not exactly uncommon. My first few patrols were uneventful. I would drive out to the trailhead before dawn, hike the boundary line for 6 or 7 miles, check the fence posts, take photos of any damage or wildlife sign, and hike back to my truck by early afternoon. The work was solitary and peaceful. I saw black bears, elk, a few coyotes, and more deer than I could count. The only humans I encountered were a couple of backpackers who had wandered slightly off the main trail system. I redirected them and filed my reports. Everything was going exactly as expected. The cemetery sat about 4 miles into my patrol route, right where the boundary line made a sharp turn to follow a ridge line. It was a small plot, maybe 30 or 40 headstones surrounded by a wrought iron fence that was still in surprisingly good condition. Some of the stones were so weathered that the names were illegible, but others were still clear. Morrison, Patterson, Whitaker. Dates ranging from 1882 to 1927. There was something peaceful about the place, honestly. Quiet. The trees grew thick around it, and in the early morning light, with the mist hanging low between the trunks, it had an almost serene quality. I started noticing the figure during my 3rd week on the job. It was early, probably around 6 in the morning. The sun was just starting to break through the canopy, and I was approaching the cemetery section of my route. I saw someone standing at the fence line, completely motionless, facing away from me. At first, I assumed it was someone from the Historical Society doing maintenance work, even though Jalen had not mentioned anyone being scheduled. As I got closer, I called out a greeting. "Park Service, just doing my patrol." The figure did not move, did not turn around, did not acknowledge me at all. I walked closer, maybe within 30 yards, and that is when I started to notice the details. The clothing was wrong. The person was wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes. A long, dark coat, the kind you might see in photographs from the late 1800s. A wide-brimmed hat. But it was summer, and even in the early morning cool, nobody dressed like that for cemetery maintenance. I called out again, louder this time, identifying myself as a park ranger. Still nothing. The figure remained perfectly still. No movement at all, not even the slight sway you would expect from someone just standing around. I stopped walking. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong. My radio was clipped to my belt, and I had my hand on it, ready to call it in, when the figure simply vanished. Not walked away, not ducked behind a tree. Vanished. 1 second it was there, solid and clear against the fence line, and the next second there was nothing but empty space and morning mist. I stood there for probably 5 full minutes, scanning the area, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. A trick of the light, maybe. The mist playing games with shadows and tree trunks. But I knew what I had seen, and it had been solid, physical, real. I completed my patrol that day, but did not mention the incident in my report. What was I supposed to write? Saw a ghost at the Morrison Cemetery. I would have sounded insane. But the encounter stayed with me. I could not shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with that section of the boundary line. The next patrol, 2 days later, I made sure to approach the cemetery area with my camera ready. I did not see the figure, but my equipment started acting strangely. My GPS lost signal completely, which had never happened before. My radio picked up bursts of static that sounded almost like voices, but too distorted to make out any words. And my camera, which had been working perfectly all morning, suddenly drained its battery within minutes. The third time I saw the figure, it was closer. I was checking a section of fence, maybe 50 yards from the cemetery, when I heard footsteps behind me. Clear, deliberate footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. I turned around, and there it was. The same figure in the same old-fashioned clothing, standing maybe 20 feet away. This time I could see more details. The coat was dark brown or black, worn and weathered. The face was shadowed by the hat, brim, but I could see pale skin and dark, hollow-looking eyes. The figure was staring directly at me, and the temperature around me seemed to drop about 20 degrees in an instant. I did not run. I'm not proud to admit that I wanted to, but I held my ground. I asked who they were and what they were doing in a restricted area. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The figure did not respond. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes. Then slowly, it raised one arm and pointed toward the cemetery. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable. It wanted me to look at something, or go somewhere. I took one step in that direction, and the figure vanished again. Just blinked out of existence like someone had flipped a switch. I reported the equipment malfunctions to Jalen that afternoon, but did not mention the figure. She seemed concerned about the GPS and radio issues and said she would have the tech guys check my gear. But that night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about that pointing gesture. What was I supposed to see? What was the figure trying to show me? Against my better judgment, I started researching the Morrison Cemetery online. Most of what I found was genealogy stuff, family trees, and census records. But I also found a newspaper article from 1923 about a man named Thomas Morrison who had disappeared while working his property near the cemetery. He was never found. His wife reported seeing him walk toward the family plot one evening, and he simply never came back. The encounters continued. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw the figure 4 more times, always in the early morning, always near the cemetery. Sometimes it would be standing at the fence. Sometimes it would be deeper in the trees, but it was always watching me, always silent, always pointing toward the same section of the graveyard. My equipment continued to malfunction in that area. Batteries died, electronics glitched, and I started hearing things. Footsteps when no one was there. Whispers in the static on my radio. Once, I clearly heard someone say my name, but when I spun around, there was nothing but empty forest. Finally, on what turned out to be my last patrol of that section, I decided to actually enter the cemetery and look at what the figure kept pointing toward. It was a grave near the back corner, more weathered than most. The name was barely legible, but I could make out enough. Thomas Morrison, 1879 to 1923, beloved husband and father. There was nothing obviously unusual about the grave itself, but as I stood there, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and loss. And then I heard it. A voice, clear as day, right behind me. "Thank you." I spun around and the figure was there, closer than it had ever been, maybe 5 feet away. I could see its face clearly now. An older man, weathered and tired looking, with deep lines around his eyes. He looked at me for one long moment, nodded once, and then faded away like morning mist in sunlight. I left the cemetery and hiked straight back to my truck. When I got to the ranger station, I told Jalen I needed to talk to her privately. I laid out everything. Every encounter, every detail, every piece of strangeness I had experienced. I expected her to laugh or suggest I take some time off. Instead, she just nodded slowly and pulled out a filing cabinet. She handed me a folder containing patrol reports dating back to the 1960s. 7 different rangers had reported similar experiences in that exact section of the boundary line. The figure in old-fashioned clothing, the equipment malfunctions, the pointing gesture toward Thomas Morrison's grave. Every detail matched. Jalen explained that the Park Service had quietly documented the encounters, but never made them public. They did not want to create a tourist attraction or deal with amateur ghost hunters trampling through a protected area. She said that most rangers who experienced the encounters eventually requested reassignment, which is exactly what I did. I finished out my contract working a different section of the forest, and when the season ended, I took a job with the Bureau of Land Management in Eastern Oregon. I have never been back to that boundary line, and I have no intention of ever going back. Whatever Thomas Morrison was looking for when he disappeared in 1923, I hope he found it, and I hope he is finally at peace. I have been working as a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park for 6 years now, and I have dealt with my share of search and rescue operations. Lost hikers, injured climbers, people who wandered off trail and could not find their way back. Most of these situations end well. We find the person within a few hours, maybe dehydrated or scraped up, but alive and grateful. The call that came in on July 14th, 2021, started out like dozens of others I had responded to. A young woman had gone missing on one of the more popular trails. Her boyfriend was frantic, insisting something terrible had happened. At the time, I figured it was just another case of someone getting disoriented and taking a wrong turn. I was wrong. The call came through dispatch around 4 in the afternoon. A 19-year-old woman named Kaylin had disappeared somewhere along the Hawksbill Summit Trail. Her boyfriend, a guy named Marcus, reported that they had been hiking together when Kaylin said she wanted to push ahead to reach the summit first. Marcus said he was tired and told her to go ahead, that he would catch up. That was around noon. When he reached the summit 20 minutes later, Kaylin was not there. He waited, thinking maybe she had taken a different spur trail or stopped to take photos. After an hour with no sign of her, he started backtracking and calling her name. Nothing. By 2 in the afternoon, he hiked back to the visitor center and reported her missing. I was part of the initial response team. 4 of us headed out to the trail with basic search equipment while dispatch notified the full search and rescue unit. Hawksbill Summit is not a particularly difficult trail. It is about 2 miles to the summit with well-maintained paths and clear markers. People hike it every single day. It is not the kind of place where someone just vanishes. Marcus met us at the trailhead, and he was visibly shaken. Kept saying that something was wrong, that Kaylin would never just wander off, that she had her phone and would have called him. We got a description: 5'4", brown hair in a ponytail, wearing a blue tank top and gray hiking pants, carrying a small black backpack. We started the search at the summit and worked our way back down, calling her name and checking every spur trail and overlook point. The sun was still up, which was good. We had maybe 4 hours of daylight left. About a mile down from the summit, one of my colleagues spotted something off the main trail. Kaylin's backpack was lying in the brush about 15 feet off the path. We secured the area and examined it carefully. The backpack was unzipped and its contents were scattered. Her phone, wallet, car keys, water bottle. Everything was there except Kaylin herself. That was when my gut told me this was not a simple lost hiker situation. We expanded the search pattern, and within another 100 yards, we found more of her belongings. Her tank top was draped over a bush, torn at the shoulder. Further along, we found one of her hiking boots, then the other boot, about 20 yards away. All of these items formed a trail leading away from the main path and deeper into the dense forest. The vegetation was thick in that area, mountain laurel and rhododendron creating almost impenetrable thickets. But someone had clearly pushed through recently. We could see broken branches and disturbed undergrowth. I radioed for additional units, and we pressed forward, following the trail of disturbed vegetation. That is when we found the footprints. Kaylin's bare footprints in a patch of soft earth, and she had been running. The prints were deep at the toes, showing forward momentum and speed. But there was a second set of prints following hers, boot prints, larger, with a distinctive waffle pattern sole. Someone had been chasing her. The realization hit all of us at the same moment. This was not a lost hiker. This was a crime scene. We moved faster now, pushing through the undergrowth and calling for Kaylin with more urgency. The trail led us almost half a mile off the main path, into an area that was not accessible to casual hikers. The terrain was steep and rocky, covered in dense vegetation that would discourage anyone from exploring. And that is where we found the camp. It was hidden in a natural depression between 2 rock outcroppings, completely invisible unless you were standing right on top of it. A small tent, dark green and weathered, a camp stove, sleeping bag, supplies, and more disturbing, items that clearly did not belong to whoever was camping there. Women's jewelry, articles of clothing, photographs. I immediately called for law enforcement backup, and we secured the perimeter. We did not enter the campsite, preserving it for forensic investigation. But from where we stood, we could see enough to know this was very bad. This was not some backpacker who had set up an illegal camp. This was someone who had been living in the park for an extended period, and the personal items scattered around suggested he had been targeting female hikers. We continued searching the immediate area, calling for Kaylin, desperately hoping we would find her alive. As darkness fell, we brought in portable lighting and more search teams. Dogs were deployed. We had maybe 30 people combing the area through the night. The camp remained undisturbed, guarded by law enforcement until forensic teams could arrive at first light. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about those boot prints following Kaylin's barefoot tracks. Kept thinking about how terrified she must have been, running through the forest with no shoes, trying to escape from someone who knew these woods far better than she did. We found Kaylin the next morning. She was 3/4 of a mile from the hidden camp, wedged into a crevice between 2 large boulders. She was alive, dehydrated, hypothermic, covered in scratches and bruises, but alive. She was conscious but non-responsive, staring straight ahead and not reacting to our voices. We got her out carefully, and the paramedics took over immediately. She was airlifted to the hospital in Charlottesville. I rode in one of the vehicles that followed the ambulance, hoping for some information about what had happened to her. But Kaylin did not speak. Not that day. Not for several days afterward. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement processed the campsite. The tent and supplies belonged to a man named Derek Hutchins, 34 years old, with a criminal record that included assault and stalking charges. He had apparently been living in the park illegally for at least 3 months, moving his camp periodically to avoid detection. The personal items found at his camp were traced back to multiple women who had reported items stolen while hiking in Shenandoah over the past year. Jewelry taken from parked cars, backpacks that had been left unattended at trailheads, clothing, photographs that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge, women hiking alone or in small groups. Hutchins was arrested 2 days later when he returned to the area. Law enforcement had staked out the camp, and he walked right into their perimeter. He tried to run but was tackled and restrained within minutes. During questioning, he admitted to living in the park and to following female hikers. He claimed he never intended to hurt anyone, that he was just watching, but the evidence told a different story. Kaylin's account, when she was finally able to speak about it weeks later, was absolutely chilling. She said that when she had pushed ahead of Marcus on the trail, she noticed someone standing off the path watching her. She thought it was just another hiker and did not think much of it. But when she reached the summit and started back down, she saw the same man again, closer this time. He started following her. At first, she tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, that they were just hiking in the same direction. But when she stopped, he stopped. When she sped up, he sped up. That is when the fear set in. Kaylin said she left the main trail hoping to loop back around and rejoin Marcus, but the man followed her into the woods. He started calling to her, saying he just wanted to talk, that he had something to show her. She started running. He chased her. She dropped her backpack, hoping it would slow him down. She kicked off her boots because they were slipping on the steep terrain. She just ran blindly through the forest, with this man crashing through the undergrowth behind her. She found the crevice between the boulders and wedged herself as far back as she could, making herself as small as possible. She could hear him searching for her, calling her name, which terrified her even more because she had not told him her name. He had been watching her long enough to know who she was. She stayed in that crevice for almost 18 hours, too terrified to move, convinced that if she made any sound, he would find her. Even after we found her, she could not process that she was safe. The trauma was severe. From what I understand, she spent months in therapy and still struggles with anxiety and PTSD. The FBI got involved because the case crossed state lines. Hutchins was connected to similar incidents in 3 other national parks over a span of 2 years. He had been living off the grid, moving from park to park, targeting solo female hikers or women in small groups. The personal items found at his Shenandoah camp helped investigators close at least 8 cold cases involving missing belongings and harassment reports. Whether he had escalated to more serious violence in other locations remained under investigation. As for me, the case changed how I approached my job. I used to think the biggest dangers in the park were natural, weather, wildlife, rough terrain, but Kaylin's case taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are human. I requested additional training in identifying signs of illegal habitation, and now I patrol remote areas with a much more critical eye. I look for disturbed vegetation, hidden camps, and any indication that someone might be living in the backcountry without authorization. And I carry the guilt that we did not catch Hutchins sooner. How many times had I walked within a quarter mile of his camp during routine patrols and never noticed anything wrong? How many women had he watched before Kaylin? I will never have those answers, but I will never stop looking for signs that someone like him is out there again. Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky is home to the longest known cave system in the world. Over 400 miles of surveyed passageways wind beneath the green hills of south-central Kentucky, and every year new sections are discovered and mapped. I have worked as a ranger at Mammoth Cave for almost 8 years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about the place. The cave system has been explored and studied for over 2 centuries. Thousands of tourists walk through the developed sections every year. It is one of the most thoroughly documented natural wonders in North America. But in the summer of 2020, I learned that there are still mysteries buried deep in those limestone passages. Mysteries that have nothing to do with geology. My name is Janae, and my primary responsibility at Mammoth Cave is managing the backcountry sections and restricted areas. Most visitors only see the main tourist routes, the well-lit passages with handrails and interpretive signs. But there are miles of undeveloped cave passages that are closed to the public for safety and conservation reasons. Some sections are too dangerous, some are too fragile, and some, like the passage known as the Hollow, have been closed for so long that most current staff do not even know why the closure was implemented in the first place. The Hollow was sealed off in 1998, according to the administrative records. The entrance was gated with heavy steel bars and posted with no trespassing signs. The official reason given was structural instability, but when I reviewed the engineering reports, I could not find any evidence of collapse risk or dangerous conditions. The passage appeared to be as stable as any other section of the cave system. It struck me as odd, but I had plenty of other responsibilities and did not pursue it further. That changed when the visitor reports started coming in. It began in late June. A family hiking one of the surface trails near the Hollow entrance reported seeing children playing near the sealed cave mouth. The parents assumed it was other visitors, but when they got closer, the children disappeared, vanished into the forest before they could be approached. The father reported it to the visitor center, concerned that kids might be accessing a dangerous restricted area. We sent rangers to investigate, but found no sign of anyone. The gate was still locked and secure. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. 2 weeks later, another report came in. A couple hiking at dawn saw what they described as 4 or 5 small figures near the cave entrance. They said the figures appeared to be children, ranging from maybe 5 to 10 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. When the couple called out to them, the figures ran toward the cave entrance and seemed to pass right through the steel gate. The couple insisted they saw it happen. The children did not climb over or squeeze through the bars. They passed through the solid metal, as if it were not there. I took that report myself, and I could tell the couple was genuinely unsettled by what they had witnessed. They were both professionals, a doctor and an attorney from Louisville, not the type to make up stories or misidentify what they had seen. They were adamant. Children had walked through a solid steel gate. After they left, I pulled the file on the Hollow again and started digging deeper. I wanted to know the real reason that section had been closed. It took some searching, but I eventually found an incident report from 1997, filed by a ranger named William Pritchard, who had retired years before I started working at Mammoth Cave. According to his report, several cave explorers and rangers had reported hearing children's voices echoing from deep within the Hollow passage. Laughter, singing, the sounds of children at play. The sounds were always distant, always impossible to pinpoint, and always stopped when anyone tried to investigate. Pritchard recommended closing the section, not because of structural concerns, but because the unexplained sounds were creating what he called an operational distraction. The closure was approved, the entrance was gated, and apparently everyone involved decided not to discuss it further. I decided to investigate the Hollow myself. I am trained in cave exploration and rescue, and I had every right to access restricted sections as part of my duties. I gathered my equipment, informed my supervisor that I was conducting a safety inspection of the sealed area, and headed out to the entrance on a quiet Tuesday morning when tourist traffic was light. The gate was exactly as it should be, locked, undisturbed. No signs of forced entry or tampering. I unlocked it, swung it open, and stepped into the darkness beyond. The Hollow was a horizontal passage, roughly 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, extending back into the limestone hillside. My headlamp cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating flowstone formations and clusters of delicate cave formations. The passage was in excellent condition. No instability, no hazards, no reason whatsoever for it to have been closed. I proceeded slowly, documenting everything with my camera and making notes on my survey map. The passage ran straight for about 200 yards before opening into a small chamber roughly 30 feet across. That is where I found the toys. They were arranged in a circle in the center of the chamber floor, a collection of objects from different time periods. A wooden yo-yo that looked like it dated from the 1950s. A small metal truck, rusted but recognizable, probably from the 1970s. A stuffed rabbit, its fur matted and discolored with age. A set of jacks, a plastic action figure from the 1990s, and more. Maybe a dozen items in total, all children's toys, all arranged in a deliberate circle as if they had been placed there for some purpose. I stood there staring at the circle for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. These toys had not been deposited here by natural processes. Someone, or multiple someones, had brought them into the cave and arranged them. But who? And more importantly, when? Some of these toys were decades old. The passage had been sealed for over 20 years. I photographed the arrangement from multiple angles, careful not to disturb anything, and then I set up my equipment to document the chamber more thoroughly. That is when I heard it. Children's laughter, faint and distant, echoing from somewhere deeper in the passage system. I froze, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable. Multiple voices, young, laughing and playing. The acoustics in caves can be strange, and sounds can travel from surprising distances, but this did not sound like echoes from the surface. This sounded like it was coming from within the cave itself. I called out, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking if anyone was there. The laughter stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. I continued deeper into the passage, following a narrow side tunnel that branched off from the main chamber. My light swept across the limestone walls, catching tiny crystal formations that glittered like stars. The passage twisted and descended, and I could feel the temperature dropping as I moved deeper. I was maybe 400 yards from the entrance when I heard the laughter again, but this time it was behind me. I spun around, my headlamp illuminating the empty passage I had just walked through. Nothing. No one. But the sound had been clear, children laughing, and they had been close, maybe within 20 or 30 feet. I made the decision to head back to the entrance. Whatever was happening in the hollow, I was not equipped to investigate it alone. As I retraced my steps through the narrow passage, I heard the laughter again, and this time it seemed to be moving through the tunnels around me, not following me, not approaching, just moving, parallel to my route, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes to my left or right, as if traveling through passages I could not see. The sound moved impossibly fast. One moment, it would be distant, echoing from somewhere deep in the cave. The next moment, it would be right beside me, so close I could almost feel breath on my neck. I reached the main chamber where the toys were arranged, or where they had been arranged. The circle was broken. The toys had been moved. Some were scattered across the chamber floor. Some were stacked in small piles. And in the center of where the circle had been, written in the fine cave dust, was a message. A single word traced in what looked like a child's handwriting. Help. I photographed it immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I adjusted my camera settings. The word was clear and deliberate. Someone had written it while I was exploring the deeper passage. Someone had been in this chamber with me, or had entered while I was gone. I left the cave quickly, but did not run. Training and experience told me that panicking in a cave environment was dangerous. I moved steadily back toward the entrance, my light sweeping constantly to check for movement or signs of whoever had written that message. I heard the laughter twice more before I reached the gate. Both times it was behind me, receding into the depths of the cave as if whatever was making the sound was staying in the darkness while I moved toward the light. I secured the gate behind me and stood in the sunlight for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I had clear photographs of the toys and the message. I had audio recordings of the laughter captured on my phone. I had documentation of everything I had witnessed, but I also had no rational explanation for any of it. That evening, I started researching the history of Mammoth Cave and the surrounding area. What I found made everything so much worse. Between 1952 and 1996, 3 separate incidents of children disappearing near Mammoth Cave were documented in local news archives. In 1952, 2 brothers aged 6 and 8 vanished while playing near one of the cave entrances. Despite extensive searches, they were never found. In 1978, a 7-year-old girl disappeared during a family camping trip. Searchers combed the cave system for weeks. Nothing. In 1996, a 9-year-old boy wandered away from a school field trip and was never seen again. The searches in all 3 cases covered hundreds of miles of cave passages. No remains were ever recovered. No evidence was ever found. I presented my findings and my documentation to park administration. There were meetings, discussions, consultations with cave experts and historians. The official decision was to permanently seal the hollow entrance with concrete, rather than just a gate. The toys and the message were documented but not removed. The site was treated as a potential grave site, and disturbing it further was deemed inappropriate. No public announcement was made. The 3 missing children cases remained officially unsolved, but park administration quietly added them to the hollow file. I requested a transfer to surface duties after that investigation. I still work at Mammoth Cave, but I do not go into the restricted passages anymore. And on quiet mornings when I am hiking the trails near the sealed entrance to the hollow, I sometimes hear the laughter echoing faintly from beneath the ground. I do not investigate anymore. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some questions are better left unasked. Working night shifts at a remote ranger station is not for everyone. The isolation, the darkness, the sounds of the forest at night, most people find it unsettling. But I've always been comfortable with solitude, and when the position opened up at the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest Ranger Station in Washington, I jumped at the opportunity. The pay differential for night work was decent, and I figured sitting in a warm station monitoring radios and filing reports was easier than hiking trails in the rain all day. For the most part, I was right. Night shifts were quiet, uneventful, and gave me plenty of time to catch up on paperwork and reading. That changed on the night of October 8th, 2022, when a man covered in blood appeared at my station door. My name is Jaslyn, and I had been working the night shift at the Pinewood station for about 7 months when this happened. The station is located off Forest Road 25, about 18 miles from the nearest town. During the day, it serves as a check-in point for backcountry permits and information. At night, it is basically just a communication hub. One ranger on duty, monitoring the radio for emergencies, logging weather data, and being available if anyone needs assistance. The shifts run from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. In 7 months, I had maybe a dozen people stop by during my shifts, usually lost drivers looking for directions or campers who had car trouble. October in the Gifford-Pinchot can be cold, especially at night. Temperatures drop into the 30s and 40s, and fog rolls through the valleys thick enough that you cannot see 20 feet in any direction. That night was particularly foggy. I remember because I had gone outside around midnight to check the weather instruments, and the fog was so dense that my flashlight beam just disappeared into a wall of white. I went back inside, logged the conditions, and settled in with my coffee and a book. The radio had been quiet all night. No check-ins, no emergency calls, nothing. At 2:14 in the morning, someone pounded on the station door. 3 hard, urgent knocks that made me jump out of my chair. We do not get visitors at 2 in the morning. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and approached the door cautiously. Through the small window, I could see a figure standing on the porch. A man, and even through the foggy glass, I could see dark stains on his clothing. I opened the door with the chain lock still engaged and identified myself as a park ranger, asking what he needed. The man was in his mid-30s, maybe 6 feet tall, wearing a heavy jacket and jeans that were soaked and muddy. His face was scratched and bleeding, and there was blood on his hands and jacket. A lot of blood. He was breathing hard, and his eyes were wide and panicked. He said he needed help. He said he had been attacked, that his friend was hurt, that we needed to call for emergency services immediately. I released the chain lock and let him inside, already reaching for the radio to call dispatch. The man stumbled into the station and collapsed into one of the chairs near the door. I got my first good look at him under the lights, and the amount of blood was alarming. His jacket was soaked with it. His hands were covered. There were smears on his face, where he had apparently wiped at his injuries. I asked him where he was hurt, and he said his head and his arms. He said someone had attacked him and his camping partner with a knife, that they had been sleeping in their tent when someone slashed through the fabric and started stabbing at them. He said he fought the attacker off and ran, but his friend was still back at the campsite and badly injured. I radioed dispatch immediately and reported a stabbing with at least one victim needing immediate medical attention. Dispatch confirmed they were sending paramedics and law enforcement to my location and asked me to get more information about where the campsite was located. I asked the man where he had been camping. He hesitated and then said they were off trail, somewhere near the old logging road past mile marker 7. I asked him how long ago the attack happened and how far he had walked to reach my station. He said maybe 20 minutes ago, and he thought the campsite was about a mile back down the road. I started going through my training protocols. Assess injuries, provide first aid if needed, keep the victim calm, gather information for law enforcement. I grabbed the first aid kit and told the man I needed to check his wounds. He pulled off his jacket, and that is when I started noticing inconsistencies. His shirt underneath had blood on it, but when I examined his arms, the cuts were superficial. Scratches, really. Nothing that would account for the amount of blood soaking his clothing. I checked his head and found a small gash near his hairline, again bleeding but not heavily. Not enough to explain the blood covering his hands and jacket. I asked him about his friend's injuries, trying to get details that paramedics would need. He said his friend had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and back, said there was a lot of blood, said he tried to stop the bleeding but could not. His story was consistent, but something about the way he told it felt wrong. His affect was off. He seemed agitated and nervous, but not in the way someone who had just survived a violent attack would be. He kept looking around the station, at the radio, at the computer, at the doors and windows, like he was assessing the space rather than seeking help. I kept him talking while we waited for backup. Asked him details about the attacker. He said it was too dark to see clearly. Said the person was wearing dark clothing and a mask. Said the attack happened so fast he barely had time to react. I asked him what his friend's name was, and he said Marcus. Asked where they were from, and he said Seattle. Asked what kind of tent they had been camping in, and he described a generic 2-person dome tent. Every answer was just vague enough to be non-specific. Backup arrived about 25 minutes after my initial call. 2 sheriff's deputies and a paramedic unit. The deputies came in first, and I briefed them on what the man had told me. One deputy stayed with the man while the other stepped outside to coordinate with the paramedics. The deputy who stayed began asking the man more detailed questions, and that is when his story started to change. First, he said the attack happened at their campsite. Then he said they had been hiking and were attacked on the trail. Then he said they were actually camping near the river, not near the logging road. The location kept shifting. The timeline kept changing. The deputy picked up on the inconsistencies immediately and called his partner back inside. They asked the man to step outside to show them on a map where the campsite was located. He became visibly agitated and said he was not sure, that everything looked different in the fog, that he had just run and did not pay attention to landmarks. The deputies exchanged a look, and one of them asked the man for identification. He said his wallet was back at the campsite. They asked his name, and he said James Cartwright. They asked his date of birth, and he hesitated before answering. One of the deputies went back to his vehicle to run the name through the system. The other stayed with the man asking more questions. Where was his vehicle? What trailhead had they started from? How long had they been camping? The man's answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. And then the deputy's radio crackled. The name James Cartwright came back with a hit. There was an active warrant out of Oregon for assault. The description matched the man sitting in my ranger station. The deputy immediately called for additional backup and informed the man that he was being detained for questioning. That is when everything fell apart. The man stood up abruptly and said he needed to leave, that his friend needed help, that we were wasting time. The deputy told him to sit back down. The man refused. He started moving toward the door, and the deputy blocked his path. The man became aggressive, shouting that we had no right to keep him there, that someone was dying. The second deputy came back inside, and between the two of them, they managed to restrain the man and place him in handcuffs. He was still shouting as they walked him out to the patrol vehicle. The paramedics asked me if I needed medical attention, and I said no. I had not been hurt. I was shaken but physically fine. The deputies asked me to write out a detailed statement of everything that had happened from the moment the man knocked on my door. I sat down at my desk and started writing, my hands trembling slightly. While I was working on my statement, one of the deputies came back inside and asked if I could show them on a map where the man had claimed the campsite was located. I pulled out the area map and pointed to the general area he had described, though his descriptions had been so inconsistent that it was difficult to pinpoint. Search teams were deployed at first light to look for the injured camping partner. They searched the areas the man had described and expanded from there, covering miles of trails and camping areas. They found nothing. No tent, no campsite, no injured victim, no blood trail, no evidence that anyone had been camping in that area recently. By mid-morning, the deputies came back to the station to update me. They said the man in custody was named Derek Lanning, not James Cartwright. He was wanted in Oregon for assault with a deadly weapon. His victim had been his former roommate, who had survived the attack and identified Lanning to police. The deputies believed that Lanning had been hiding in the national forest to evade arrest. They theorized that he had gotten into an altercation with someone, possibly a homeless individual or another person hiding in the forest. The blood on his clothing was being tested, but they suspected it belonged to someone else, not Lanning. Whether that person was alive or dead, injured or killed, remained unknown. Search and rescue continued looking for several days, but never found another victim. No body, no injured person, no evidence of the attack Lanning had described. The case went to the FBI because it crossed state lines and involved potential violence on federal land. Lanning was extradited to Oregon to face charges on the existing warrant. The blood on his clothing was analyzed and came back as a match to an individual named Marcus Chen, who had been reported missing from Seattle 2 weeks before Lanning showed up at my station. Marcus Chen's body was eventually found 3 months later by a hiker in a remote area of the Gifford Pinchot, buried in a shallow grave about 5 miles from my ranger station. Forensic evidence linked Lanning to the murder. Apparently, Lanning and Chen had been acquaintances, had gone camping together, and Lanning had killed him during a dispute over money. The night Lanning appeared at my station, he had apparently panicked and fabricated the story about being attacked, hoping to establish an alibi or misdirect the investigation. His plan fell apart when the deputies recognized the inconsistencies in his story and ran his name through the system. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. I testified at his trial about the night he appeared at the ranger station, about his behavior and his contradictory statements. I still work night shifts at remote ranger stations, but I requested a transfer to a different location after the Lanning case. Not because I was afraid exactly, but because every time someone knocked on the station door after dark, I would remember that October night and the man covered in blood who had killed his friend and thought he could talk his way out of it. I developed protocols for myself after that. I always keep the door chain locked. I always call in any visitors immediately and I always trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. That lesson might have saved my life that night, and it is one I will never forget. I grew up in northern Arizona, and I've always been aware of the cultural significance of the land. The Colorado Plateau is not just beautiful wilderness, it is home to multiple native nations, and there are places throughout the region that hold deep spiritual meaning. When I became a park ranger at the Grand Canyon, I understood that part of my job was respecting those sacred spaces and helping visitors do the same. What I did not understand, at least not until the incident with the hermit trail markers, was that some of those spaces actively protect themselves in ways that defy rational explanation. My name is Indiana, and I have been working at Grand Canyon National Park for 4 years. My primary responsibility is trail maintenance on the less traveled routes on the South Rim. The popular trails like Bright Angel and South Kaiba get plenty of attention and funding. My job is to maintain the quieter trails, the ones that see maybe a few dozen hikers per week instead of hundreds per day. The Hermit Trail is one of those routes. It is a steep, unmaintained trail that descends from the rim down to the Colorado River. The National Park Service officially designates it as unmaintained, which means we do minimal work on it, but we still place and maintain trail markers to prevent hikers from getting lost in the maze of side canyons and drainage routes. The section of the Hermit Trail that caused problems was between Cathedral Stairs and Lookout Point, a stretch of about 2 miles that wound through a particularly rugged section of canyon. The trail markers in that area had a reputation among the maintenance staff. They moved. Not because of vandalism or weather. They moved on their own. I heard the stories when I first started working at the park, but I dismissed them as folklore. Rangers like to tell tall tales to new employees, ghost stories and legends to pass the time. I figured the marker movement had a rational explanation. Animals knocking them over, flash floods shifting them, tourists moving them as pranks. I was assigned to remark that section in late September of 2023. Previous markers had been found out of position during a routine patrol, arranged in a pattern that led hikers off the established trail and into a restricted area. The restricted zone was a side canyon that connected to tribal lands, and we were specifically instructed to keep hikers away from it. The tribe had requested that the area remain undisturbed, and we honored that request. I gathered my equipment, loaded up a dozen new trail markers, and hiked out to the problem section. The markers I found were not just out of position. They had been deliberately relocated to form a clear path leading away from the Hermit Trail and directly toward the restricted canyon. The spacing was precise, the placement intentional. It looked exactly like someone had carefully planned an alternate route. I documented everything with photographs, pulled up the incorrectly placed markers, and repositioned them according to the official trail map. The work took most of the afternoon, and by the time I finished, I was satisfied that the trail was properly marked and hikers would stay on the correct route. I returned 2 days later to check my work, which is standard protocol. When I reached the section I had remarked, I stopped and stared in disbelief. The markers had been moved again. Every single one had been relocated to the exact same wrong positions I had found them in originally. The same spacing, the same deliberate path leading towards the restricted canyon, the same configuration. I checked the markers themselves and confirmed they were the ones I had installed. They had my placement date scratched into the base. These were not new markers. These were mine, moved overnight to form the same pattern. I repositioned them again, this time using additional stakes and securing each marker more firmly. I also set up a trail camera focused on one of the markers, hoping to catch whoever was moving them. Vandals, I assumed, probably someone who thought they were being clever or funny. I hiked back to the rim and filed a report noting possible vandalism and my decision to install camera monitoring. 3 days later, I returned to check the camera and the markers. The markers had moved again. Same positions, same pattern, same path leading to the restricted area. I retrieved the trail camera and sat down right there on the trail to review the footage. The camera had been recording for 72 hours, triggered by motion. I scrolled through the footage: deer walking past, a coyote investigating one of the markers, a raven landing on a rock. Nothing unusual until I reached the footage from the previous night. At 2:37 in the morning, the marker in frame simply moved. It did not fall over. It was not pushed by an animal. It slid across the ground smoothly and deliberately, about 15 feet from its correct position to the wrong position. The movement took maybe 10 seconds. There was no visible cause. No person. No animal. No wind strong enough to move a staked marker. It just moved. I watched the footage 3 times, looking for any explanation. Camera malfunction, light distortion, anything. But the footage was clear. The marker moved on its own. I checked the other markers and found them in the wrong positions, forming that same deliberate path. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I had witnessed. Everything in my training and experience told me there had to be a rational explanation, but I could not think of one that fit the evidence. I decided to consult with someone who might have insight into what was happening. There is a liaison office at the park that coordinates with the Havasupai tribe and other native nations on cultural and resource issues. I made an appointment and met with a woman named Sarah, who worked as the cultural resources coordinator. I showed her the photographs of the marker placements, the map of where they were leading, and after some hesitation, the trail camera footage. I expected her to be skeptical or dismissive. Instead, she nodded slowly and asked if I knew what was in that restricted canyon. She explained that the area was considered sacred by multiple tribal groups. It had been used for centuries as a spiritual site, a place where certain ceremonies were conducted, and where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was considered thin. The canyon had been closed to public access through an agreement with the Park Service specifically to protect its cultural significance. She said that similar reports had been documented over the years. Trail markers that moved. Hikers who reported feeling compelled to enter the restricted area. Rangers who experienced equipment malfunctions or disorientation in that section of trail. Sarah said that from a traditional perspective, what was happening was not malicious. The spirits associated with that place were guiding lost souls, people who wandered too close to the sacred area, who were spiritually adrift or seeking something they could not name, were being called. The moving markers were not trying to harm anyone. They were offering a path to those who needed it. But for ordinary hikers just trying to complete a trail, following those markers would lead them into an area where they did not belong and could potentially experience things they were not prepared to understand. She offered to arrange a meeting with tribal elders who might be willing to speak with me about the situation. I agreed, and 2 weeks later, I met with 3 elders in a private meeting room at the park headquarters. They were gracious and patient as I explained what had been happening with the trail markers. They asked detailed questions about the exact location, the timing of the movements, and what I had observed. One of the elders, a man who appeared to be in his 70s, finally spoke and said that the issue was not one that could be solved by repositioning markers or installing cameras. He explained that the sacred site was protecting itself. It had been disturbed too many times over the years by people who did not understand its significance. The spirits associated with the place were ensuring that those who needed to find it could, while making it difficult for casual visitors to stumble upon it accidentally. The moving markers were a manifestation of that protection. He said that fighting against it, continuing to reposition the markers to the official trail, would only create more confusion and potentially put hikers at risk. His recommendation was to reroute the trail entirely, giving the sacred area a wider buffer. I presented that recommendation to park administration, backed by the Cultural Liaison Office and documentation from the tribal consultation. It took several months of meetings and planning, but eventually the decision was made to officially reroute the Hermit Trail. The new route bypassed the problematic section entirely, adding about a mile to the overall trail length, but avoiding the restricted canyon area. New markers were installed along the rerouted section, and the old section was closed and designated as a cultural sensitivity zone. No markers, no maintained trail, just wilderness left to exist as it had for centuries. The new route has been in place for over a year now, and there have been no further reports of markers moving or hikers becoming disoriented in that area. The trail is clear, the markers stay where they are placed, and the restricted canyon remains undisturbed. I still maintain the Hermit Trail as part of my duties, but I approach that section with a different mindset now. I understand that I am not just maintaining a hiking route. I am helping to protect something that existed long before the National Park Service, something that will exist long after we are all gone. I think about that trail camera footage sometimes, the marker sliding across the ground with no visible cause, the deliberate pattern leading to a place I was never meant to see. It challenged everything I thought I knew about how the world works, but it also taught me an important lesson about respecting the land and the cultures that have stewarded it for generations. Some places are not meant to be accessed by everyone. Some boundaries exist for reasons that go deeper than safety or conservation, and sometimes the land itself will enforce those boundaries in ways that defy our understanding but demand our respect. Search and rescue operations are some of the most intense experiences a park ranger can face. When someone activates an emergency beacon in the backcountry, it means something has gone seriously wrong. Every minute counts. The terrain is usually difficult, weather conditions are often poor, and the person you are trying to find is injured, lost, or in immediate danger. In my 12 years as a ranger at North Cascades National Park in Washington, I have been part of dozens of search and rescue missions. Most end successfully with the lost or injured hiker found and evacuated safely. A few end in tragedy when we arrive too late. But the rescue operation for the backpacker named Dalen was different from any other mission I have ever been part of. And to this day, I do not have a rational explanation for what happened out there. The call came in on the morning of August 19th, 2021. A personal locator beacon had been activated deep in the Picket Range, one of the most remote and rugged sections of the North Cascades. The beacon belonged to a registered backcountry user named Dalen Richards, a 32-year-old experienced backpacker from Portland who had been solo hiking the Challenger Glacier route. According to his itinerary filed with our office, he had started his trip 4 days earlier on August 15th and was scheduled to return on August 21st. The beacon activation put him somewhere near Luna Lake, about 15 miles into the wilderness from the nearest trailhead. We assembled a team of 6 rangers and wilderness medics and deployed via helicopter to a landing zone as close to the beacon coordinates as we could safely get. From there, it was a 3-hour hike over extremely difficult terrain to reach the location. The Picket Range is serious mountain country, glaciers, steep ridges, loose rock, and unpredictable weather. This is not a place where casual hikers wander. Anyone traveling through that area needs technical skills and experience. Dalen's permit application had shown he was qualified, with multiple previous trips into alpine wilderness and mountaineering training. That made the beacon activation even more concerning. If someone with his experience was calling for help, the situation had to be serious. We reached the beacon coordinates around 2 in the afternoon. The signal was strong and clear, leading us to a flat area near the shore of Luna Lake. And there was Dalen, sitting calmly on a rock near the water, watching us approach. He was not injured, not visibly distressed. He looked completely fine. He stood up as we got closer and asked why we were there. I remember the confusion on everyone's faces. We had just hiked 3 hours through brutal terrain in response to his emergency beacon, and he was asking us why we were there. I identified myself and explained that we were responding to his emergency activation. He looked genuinely confused and said he had not activated his beacon, He pulled it from his pack and showed it to us. The device was in standby mode, not activated, but our dispatch had received a clear signal from his registered device, and we had followed that signal directly to his location. I asked him if he was injured or in distress, if he needed any assistance. He said no, he was fine. He said he had been hiking for a few hours that morning and had stopped at Luna Lake to rest and have lunch. Everything was going according to plan. One of our medics asked if we could check him over anyway, standard protocol for any rescue call. Dalen agreed and sat down while the medic conducted a basic physical assessment. Vital signs were normal, no injuries, no signs of illness or distress. But the medic noticed something odd. Dalen was severely dehydrated. His lips were cracked, his skin had poor turgor, and his mucous membranes were dry. Classic signs of dehydration that would take days to develop. The medic asked when Dalen had last had water to drink. He said he had drunk from his water bottle about an hour ago. The medic asked to see the bottle. It was full. Dalen looked at it, confused, and said he must have refilled it and forgotten. I pulled out my GPS and asked Dalen to show me on the map where he had camped the previous night. He pointed to a location about 5 miles back along his route. I asked where he had camped the night before that. He seemed confused by the question and said he had only been out for one night. He had started his trip yesterday morning, hiked to a campsite, slept, and then hiked to Luna Lake today. But his permit showed he had started 4 days earlier on August 15th. Today was August 19th. He had been in the wilderness for 4 days, not 2. Dalen insisted we were wrong. He pulled out his own GPS device and showed us the date, August 17th, but our devices all showed August 19th. He checked his watch. It showed August 17th. He argued that our equipment must be malfunctioning, that there was no way he had been out here for 4 days. He had only packed food for 3 days total, and he still had food left. He would have run out if he had been hiking for 4 days. I asked him to show me his remaining food. He opened his bare canister. There was maybe 1 meal's worth of food remaining. Not enough for someone who claimed to have only been out for 2 days and still had 2 more days of hiking planned. The situation was becoming increasingly strange. Dalen's physical condition, his equipment, and the timeline we had documented did not match his perception of how long he'd been in the wilderness. One of our team members suggested that Dalen might have hit his head or experienced some kind of medical event that affected his memory. But Dalen insisted his memory was fine. He remembered everything from his trip, starting at the trailhead on the morning of August 16th, hiking to his campsite, waking up on the 17th, and hiking to Luna Lake. He remembered specific details: the weather, the wildlife he had seen, the terrain he had crossed. His memories were clear and consistent. They just did not match reality. We made the decision to evacuate Dalen for medical evaluation. He protested, saying he was fine and wanted to complete his trip, but we insisted. Something was clearly wrong, even if we could not identify what it was. We hiked back to the helicopter landing zone with Dalen, and he was flown to the hospital in Bellingham for a full medical workup. I accompanied him on the flight and spent the trip trying to piece together what had happened. At the hospital, Dalen underwent a battery of tests: CT scan of his head, blood work, neurological examination. Everything came back normal. No head injury, no drugs or toxins in his system, no medical explanation for memory loss or confusion. But the physical evidence of his condition told a different story. He was severely dehydrated, having lost approximately 8 pounds from his starting weight documented on his permit. His body showed signs of malnutrition consistent with 4 days of strenuous activity with insufficient caloric intake. His boots showed wear patterns consistent with approximately 40 miles of hiking, which matched the distance he would have covered in 4 days following his planned route. The most disturbing piece of evidence came from his camera. Dalen had been taking photos throughout his trip, and when we reviewed the images on his camera's memory card, we found photographs dated across 4 days. August 15th, trailhead. August 16th, first campsite. August 17th, Challenger Glacier. August 18th, various locations. August 19th, Luna Lake. The photos showed Dalen at locations he claimed he had never visited, landscapes he did not remember seeing, campsites where he insisted he had never stayed. The metadata confirmed the dates and timestamps. The photos were real, taken by his camera, showing him in locations across 4 days of hiking, but he had no memory of any of it beyond the 2 days he insisted had passed. A psychiatrist evaluated Dalen for dissociative episodes or other psychiatric conditions that might explain the memory gap. The evaluation found no evidence of mental illness or psychological trauma. Dalen was rational, coherent, and genuinely confused about the discrepancy between his memories and the documented evidence. He was not lying or fabricating his account. He truly believed only 2 days had passed, and he had no explanation for the missing time. After 3 days of medical evaluation, Dalen was released with no clear diagnosis. The medical team could not explain what had happened to him. They could not explain the missing time or why his memories did not match the physical evidence. The official report listed it as an unexplained incident, possibly related to a brief period of altered consciousness or confusion, but no definitive cause was identified. I did my own research after that incident. I went through our records looking for similar cases, and I found 4 other incidents in North Cascades over a span of 20 years where hikers had experienced missing time. All in the Picket Range, all involving solo backpackers, all reporting significantly shorter trips than the evidence indicated. In 2003, a hiker thought he had been out for 2 days, but evidence showed 5 days. In 2011, a woman believed her trip was 3 days, but it was 7. In 2016, a man insisted he had only been hiking for 1 day when he had been missing for 4. The pattern was consistent and deeply unsettling. I contacted the other rangers who had been involved in those previous cases. 2 had retired, but I was able to speak with them by phone. Both remembered the incidents clearly, and both had the same reaction I did. The hikers were not lying. They genuinely had no memory of the missing time, and no one could explain how or why it happened. The area where these incidents occurred is remote and rugged, far from any roads or development. There are no unusual geological features or documented environmental hazards that would cause memory loss or disorientation. No natural gas seeps, no toxic plants, no extreme altitude that would explain the symptoms. Just wilderness, the same wilderness that thousands of hikers have traveled through without incident. I have tried to find rational explanations. Microsleeps while hiking causing gaps in memory formation. Extreme exhaustion affecting perception of time. Nutritional deficiencies causing cognitive impairment. But none of those explanations fit the pattern. The hikers were experienced. They were properly equipped. They were in good health. And the missing time was always substantial. Days rather than hours. With no memory of the events that occurred during that period. Dalen never returned to the North Cascades. He told me in a phone call months later that the incident had shaken him too deeply. He said he still had no memory of those 2 missing days, and not knowing what happened to him during that time was terrifying. He said he had looked at the photos from his camera hundreds of times, trying to trigger some memory, but they were images of a trip he did not remember taking. The National Park Service has never issued any public statement about the missing time incidents in the Picket Range. The area remains open to backcountry travel, and hundreds of hikers pass through it every year without any problems. But internally, we flag it. We pay closer attention to permit applications for that area. We follow up more carefully with hikers who return from trips in the Picket Range, and we document anything unusual, adding to a file that grows slowly but steadily, full of questions we cannot answer and mysteries we cannot solve. Wildlife poaching is an ongoing problem in national forests across the country. Deer, elk, and other game animals are illegally killed for meat or trophies, usually by people who either do not want to pay for hunting licenses or who hunt outside of legal seasons. Most poaching cases are straightforward. We find evidence of illegal kills, set up surveillance, catch the perpetrators, and turn them over to law enforcement. Fines and confiscated equipment usually follow. It is a frustrating part of the job, but it is routine. What I encountered in the Chattahoochee National Forest in Georgia during the fall of 2022 was not routine poaching. It was something far darker, and it led to one of the most disturbing criminal investigations I have ever been part of. My name is Talon, and I have been working as a ranger in the Chattahoochee National Forest for 9 years. The forest covers over 750,000 acres of North Georgia mountains, and my patrol area includes some of the most remote sections. In late October of 2022, I started receiving reports from hikers about dead deer found in the backcountry. That in itself was not unusual. Animals die from natural causes, vehicle strikes, or predation, but the descriptions from the hikers suggested these deaths were not natural. The deer had been butchered, but not in the way hunters typically process game. I hiked out to investigate the first reported carcass on October 28th. It was located about 3 miles off the main trail system in a densely wooded ravine. When I found it, I understood immediately why the hikers who reported it had been disturbed. The deer had been killed recently, probably within the past day or two, but instead of being field dressed for meat, it had been mutilated. The heart, liver, and kidneys had been removed with what looked like surgical precision. The rest of the carcass had been left to rot. No attempt had been made to harvest the meat or hide, just the organs removed and the body abandoned. I documented the scene with photographs and GPS coordinates, then continued searching the area. Within a quarter mile, I found 2 more deer carcasses in similar condition. Both had been killed recently. Both had specific organs removed. Both had been left to decay. This was not subsistence poaching or trophy hunting. Someone was killing deer specifically to harvest their organs, and I could not think of any legitimate reason someone would do that. I filed a detailed report with my supervisor and with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Law Enforcement Division. We decided to set up trail cameras in the area to try to identify who was responsible. I installed 4 cameras covering different approach routes to the location where I had found the carcasses. The cameras were motion activated and designed to be difficult to spot. If the poachers returned to the area, we would get photographs or video of them. 3 days later, I returned to check the cameras. I found 3 more deer carcasses in the same general area, all killed and mutilated in the same manner. The organs had been removed, the bodies left behind, but the trail cameras had captured footage. I retrieved the memory cards and reviewed them back at the ranger station. What I saw made me immediately call law enforcement. The footage showed 3 individuals, all wearing dark clothing and face coverings, arriving at the site around 2 in the morning. They were carrying equipment, including knives, plastic containers, and what looked like coolers. The video showed them arranging items around one of the deer carcasses in a deliberate pattern: candles, stones, what appeared to be symbols drawn in the dirt. Then they proceeded to remove organs from the deer with practiced efficiency, placing them in the containers. The entire process took about 40 minutes, and when they were finished, they packed up their equipment and disappeared back into the forest. The behavior captured on video was deeply disturbing. This was not poaching for food or profit. This appeared to be some kind of ritual activity involving animal remains. I provided the footage to the Georgia DNR law enforcement officers, who immediately escalated the case to the county sheriff's department. The sheriff's office assigned 2 detectives to the investigation, and we coordinated a plan to catch the individuals if they returned to the area. We set up a more extensive surveillance operation. Multiple rangers and law enforcement officers positioned in concealed locations around the site. We maintained the surveillance for 5 nights, taking turns on watch. On the sixth night, November 9th, the suspects returned. We observed them from a distance as they repeated the same ritual behavior with a freshly killed deer. Once we had clear documentation of the illegal activity, we moved in to make arrests. 3 individuals were detained at the scene, 2 men and 1 woman, all in their late 20s to early 30s. They were cooperative during the arrest, but refused to answer questions about what they were doing or why. Their equipment was confiscated as evidence: knives, containers with animal organs, ritual implements, and personal items. The suspects were transported to the county jail and booked on charges of illegal hunting, animal cruelty, and criminal trespass on federal land. I remained at the scene with forensic investigators to process the area. We documented everything: the ritual arrangement, the deer carcasses, the patterns drawn in the dirt. And then, one of the investigators, who was using a metal detector to search for buried evidence, got a strong signal near the base of a large oak tree. We excavated carefully, expecting to find buried equipment or maybe ritual items. What we found were bones, human bones, buried in a shallow grave about 2 feet below the surface. The excavation stopped immediately, and the county coroner was called to the scene. Over the next several hours, forensic anthropologists carefully exhumed the remains. Based on the initial examination, the bones belonged to an adult human who had been buried for approximately 6 to 8 months. The remains were incomplete, with several major bones missing, including parts of the skull and ribs. The discovery transformed the investigation from a poaching case into a potential homicide. The 3 suspects in custody were held without bail and questioned extensively. Initially, they refused to cooperate, but after being informed that human remains had been found at their ritual site, one of them agreed to talk in exchange for a plea deal. What he described was deeply disturbing. The group had been involved in what they called ceremonial practices that they claimed were based on ancient traditions. The practices involved animal sacrifice and the use of animal organs in rituals they believed would grant them spiritual power. The suspect claimed they had been conducting these rituals for over a year, always in remote forest locations where they believed they would not be discovered. He insisted they had never harmed any humans and had no knowledge of how human remains ended up at one of their ritual sites. But the investigators were not convinced. A missing persons report filed 8 months earlier matched the approximate time frame for when the remains had been buried. A 27-year-old man named Marcus Chen from Atlanta had disappeared during a solo camping trip in the Chattahoochee National Forest in March of 2022. He had never returned home, and despite searches by rangers and volunteer groups, no trace of him had been found. Dental records confirmed that the remains we had discovered belonged to Marcus Chen. Further investigation revealed that one of the suspects owned a vehicle that had been seen at the same trailhead where Marcus had parked before his disappearance. Security camera footage from a nearby gas station showed the suspect's vehicle in the area on the dates Marcus was camping. Cell phone records placed the suspects in the national forest at the same time Marcus was there. The evidence was building toward a homicide case. Under interrogation, one of the other suspects eventually broke and admitted what had happened. They had encountered Marcus at a remote campsite. There had been a confrontation about the noise from their ritual activities. The confrontation escalated. One of the suspects stabbed Marcus during the altercation. They panicked and decided to bury his body rather than report what had happened. They chose a location near where they had been conducting their rituals, believing it was remote enough that the body would never be found. The case went to trial 8 months later. All 3 suspects were charged with second-degree murder, concealment of a death, and multiple counts of animal cruelty and poaching. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic proof, the video footage, the confessions. All 3 were convicted. The 2 who had directly participated in Marcus Chen's death received 25-year sentences. The 3rd, who had helped conceal the death but was not present during the actual killing, received 15 years. Marcus Chen's family attended the trial. I testified about discovering the ritual sites and the subsequent investigation. Sitting in that courtroom and watching the family members react to the details of what had happened to their son was one of the hardest things I have ever done. They had spent months hoping he was still alive somewhere, that maybe he had just decided to disappear and start over. Learning the truth was devastating. The case changed how I patrol the backcountry. I pay much closer attention to signs of human activity in remote areas, disturbed ground, evidence of fires, anything that suggests people have been spending time in locations where they have no legitimate reason to be. And I think about Marcus Chen every time I'm out in those woods, how he was just trying to enjoy a camping trip and ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering people involved in activities that should never have been happening on public land. Poaching remains an ongoing problem in the national forests. But after this case, I approach every investigation differently. What seems like simple wildlife crime can sometimes be connected to much darker activities. And the remote wilderness that attracts people seeking solitude and natural beauty can also attract those who want to operate in the shadows, far from oversight or consequences. My job is to make sure those shadows are not as hidden as people think, and that federal land remains safe for the thousands of visitors who use it legally and responsibly every year. Fire lookout towers have been part of the American wilderness landscape for over a century. Perched on mountaintops and ridges, these towers served as early warning systems for forest fires, staffed by dedicated observers who spent weeks or months in isolated vigil. Most lookouts have been replaced by modern technology, aerial surveillance, and satellite monitoring, but a few historic towers remain operational, maintained by the Forest Service and occasionally staffed during peak fire season. The Granite Peak Lookout in Idaho's Clearwater National Forest is one of those towers. It was built in 1934 and has been continuously maintained since then. When I volunteered to staff it for 2 weeks in July of 2021, I thought I was signing up for peaceful solitude and spectacular views. I had no idea the tower had a reputation among rangers, or that my stint there would be the most terrifying experience of my life. My name is Dion, and I have been working seasonal positions with the Forest Service for 6 years. I have always enjoyed the solitary aspects of the job. Long patrols through empty wilderness, camping alone in the backcountry, spending hours without seeing another person. When the opportunity to staff Granite Peak Lookout came up, I jumped at it. 2 weeks in a historic tower, watching for smoke, reading books, and enjoying uninterrupted quiet. It sounded perfect. The tower sits at an elevation of just over 7,000 feet, accessible only by a steep 3-mile trail. There is no road access, no electricity, no running water. Everything needed for the 2-week stint had to be hiked in or delivered by helicopter. The tower itself is a small wooden structure, maybe 14 feet square, built on top of a 40-foot steel frame. Windows on all sides provide 360-degree views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. Inside, there is a table with firefighting equipment, a cot, a small propane stove, and storage for food and supplies. Primitive but functional. I hiked up to the tower on July 12th with a full pack of supplies. The ranger I was relieving, a guy named Tom, who had been up there for the previous 2 weeks, met me at the base of the tower. He looked tired and seemed eager to leave. We spent about an hour going over the procedures and equipment, how to use the firefinder, how to report smoke sightings, weather observation protocols, basic stuff. But as Tom was packing up his gear to hike out, he mentioned something that struck me as odd. He said I might hear footsteps on the stairs at night. He said not to worry about it, that it was just the tower settling or wind causing the metal frame to creak. Then he left before I could ask him what he meant. The first 3 days were exactly what I had hoped for. Beautiful weather, stunning views, no fires to report. I spent my days scanning the horizons with binoculars, reading, and enjoying the solitude. The nights were cold at that elevation, even in July, but I had a good sleeping bag, and the small propane heater kept the tower cabin comfortable. I slept well and woke each morning to watch the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. On the fourth night, I heard the footsteps. I had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the sound woke me. Someone was climbing the metal stairs that led up to the tower cabin. The footsteps were steady and deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause. The metal stairs rang with each footfall. I sat up in my cot, listening and trying to understand what I was hearing. We were 3 miles from the nearest trailhead. No one had any reason to hike up here in the middle of the night. And if someone was approaching, they would have a flashlight or headlamp, but I could see no light through the windows. The footsteps continued. I could track their progress up the stairway by the sound. 20 steps, 30 steps, getting closer to the cabin level. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the door, preparing to call out and identify myself. The footsteps reached the landing just outside the cabin door. Then they stopped. Complete silence. I stood there with my hand on the door handle, waiting for a knock or a voice. Nothing. After maybe a minute of silence, I opened the door and shined my flashlight onto the landing. Nobody there. The landing was empty. I went down several steps and checked the stairway below. Nothing. No one. I convinced myself that Tom had been right. The tower settling. Metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Wind creating sounds that mimicked footsteps. I went back inside, locked the door, and eventually fell back asleep. But the footsteps happened again the next night. Same time. Same steady rhythm climbing the stairs. Same stopping point at the landing outside my door. And when I checked, nobody was there. On the 6th night, I decided not to get up when the footsteps started, else I would just lie in my cot and listen, proving to myself that it was an explainable phenomenon and not something I needed to worry about. The footsteps climbed the stairs as usual, but this time they did not stop at the landing. The cabin door rattled as if someone was testing the handle. Then the footsteps began walking around the perimeter of the cabin, circling on the narrow catwalk that surrounded the structure. I could hear them clearly, metal footsteps ringing on the metal catwalk, walking around the cabin in a slow circle, once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped at the door again, and the handle rattled a second time. I was terrified. I did not move from my cot. I barely breathed. Whatever was out there circled the cabin twice more before the sounds finally stopped. Silence. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat on my cot with my flashlight and my radio, waiting for sunrise. When daylight finally came, I went outside and examined every inch of the catwalk and stairs, looking for footprints, marks, anything that would explain what I had heard. The metal surfaces were covered in dust and dirt, and there were no prints or disturbances in the grime. Nothing that suggested anyone or anything had walked there during the night. I found the journal on the 7th day. It was in a storage box under the cot, tucked beneath some old maps and maintenance records. A notebook with entries from previous lookout staff dating back to 1987. I started reading through it and discovered I was not the first person to experience the nighttime footsteps. Entry after entry described the same phenomena. Footsteps climbing the stairs, the door handle rattling, footsteps circling the cabin. Some entries were brief and matter-of-fact. Others were longer and more frightened. One entry from 2003 mentioned seeing a figure standing at the base of the tower at dawn, but when the observer climbed down to investigate, there was no one there. An entry from 2015 described waking to find every window in the cabin fogged from the inside with a handprint on each pane, as if someone had stood at each window simultaneously and pressed their palm against the glass. The final entry in the journal was from Tom, the ranger I had relieved. He had written it the morning before I arrived. It read, 2 weeks here, footsteps every night. On the last night, someone knocked on the door at 3 a.m. I did not answer. When I checked at sunrise, there was no one. I'm leaving now, and I will not be coming back. That explained why he had seemed so eager to leave and why he had barely mentioned the footsteps phenomenon. He had been genuinely frightened and wanted to get off that mountain as quickly as possible. I considered hiking out early. I'd completed 7 days of my 14-day assignment. I could claim illness or equipment failure and request a replacement. But I also felt a stubborn determination not to let the situation defeat me. I'd committed to 2 weeks, and I intended to fulfill that commitment. So I stayed. And the phenomena continued. Footsteps every night, the door handle rattling, the sound of someone circling the cabin. On the 10th night, I woke to find all 4 windows fogged over from the inside despite the temperature, in the cabin being comfortable and not conducive to condensation. On the 11th night, the propane heater turned itself off 3 times, each time requiring me to get out of bed and relight the pilot. The final night, my 14th and last night in the tower, the activity peaked. The footsteps started earlier than usual, around midnight. They climbed the stairs and circled the cabin repeatedly. The door handle rattled constantly for what felt like hours. And then around 3 in the morning, everything went silent. Not just the footsteps, all sound. The wind stopped. The normal creaking of the tower structure stopped. Even my own breathing seemed muted. The silence was absolute and heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then I heard a voice, quiet and distant but clear, coming from somewhere below the tower. Just one word, my name, spoken once, then silence again. I did not investigate. I stayed in my cot with every light in the cabin turned on and waited for sunrise. When dawn finally broke, I packed my gear in record time and hiked down that mountain without looking back. I completed my exit interview and filed my observation reports but did not mention the paranormal activity. I figured it was documented well enough in the journal I had left in the tower. The Forest Service has continued to staff Granite Peak Lookout with volunteers who spend 1 or 2 weeks at a time up there during fire season. I wonder if they read the journal. I wonder if they experience the same things I did. And I wonder who or what haunts that tower and why. The tower was originally staffed by a man named Robert Hutchins from 1934 until 1952, when he died of a heart attack while on duty. His body was not discovered for 3 days because of bad weather that prevented anyone from reaching the tower. I learned that detail months after my experience there, while researching the tower's history. Whether Robert still walks those stairs, or whether something else occupies that space, I cannot say. But I know what I heard and experienced, and I will never staff a fire lookout tower again. Sound behaves strangely in canyon systems. The geology creates natural amplifiers and distortion effects that can make voices carry for miles or seem to come from directions completely opposite their actual source. Echoes bounce off rock walls and return seconds or even minutes later. Experienced canyon rangers learn to account for these acoustic peculiarities. We understand that what sounds like someone calling for help from the north might actually be coming from the south, reflected and redirected by the canyon walls. But there are limits to what geology and physics can explain. What I experienced in Palo Duro Canyon in Texas during a routine patrol in September of 2023 went far beyond the normal acoustic oddities of canyon terrain, and I still do not have a rational explanation for what happened. My name is Kendricks, and I have been working as a ranger at Palo Duro Canyon State Park for 7 years. Palo Duro is the second largest canyon system in the United States, carved by the Prairie Dog Town Fork of the Red River over millions of years. The canyon is roughly 120 miles long and up to 20 miles wide in places, with walls reaching depths of over 800 feet. It is spectacular and dramatic landscape, with layered rock formations in shades of red, orange, and white, creating a visual feast for the thousands of visitors who come here every year. The canyon is also known for unusual acoustic properties. Sounds carry in unexpected ways. Voices echo and re-echo until they become unrecognizable. Rangers and frequent visitors learn to expect the unexpected when it comes to sounds in the canyon. I was conducting a solo patrol along the Eastern Rim Trail on September 14th, 2023. It was mid-afternoon on a Thursday, and visitor traffic was light. I had maybe seen 3 or 4 other hikers during the first 2 hours of my patrol, and the last group had passed me going the opposite direction almost an hour earlier. I was alone on a section of trail that followed the canyon rim, offering spectacular views down into the depths. The weather was clear and warm, typical for September in the Texas Panhandle. I was documenting trail conditions and checking markers, routine work that I had done hundreds of times before. That is when I heard my name, clear and distinct. Someone calling Kendricks from somewhere down in the canyon. I stopped and listened. The voice called again. Kendricks, help. It sounded like it was coming from maybe a quarter mile away, echoing up from the canyon depths. My immediate assumption was that someone was in distress, possibly injured or lost, and somehow knew my name. Maybe they had seen my name tag earlier or heard another visitor address me. I radioed dispatch and reported a possible emergency, then started looking for the best route to descend toward where I thought the voice was coming from. The voice called again. Kendricks. Same tone, same volume, but this time I noticed something odd. It sounded exactly like my own voice. Not similar, not close, identical. I was hearing my own voice calling my own name from down in the canyon. I stopped and tried to understand what I was hearing. An echo, possibly. But an echo of what? I had not spoken my name. I had not called out. And even if I had, echoes do not work that way. They repeat what was said. They do not generate new phrases or context. I called back. This is Ranger Kendricks. Where are you? Do you need assistance? My voice echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls and returning in fragments. Help. Assistance. Ranger. The normal acoustic behavior I was used to. But then the other voice called again. Kendricks, come down here. Still in my voice. Still impossibly clear despite the distance. I tried to locate the source visually, scanning the canyon walls and floor with my binoculars. I could not see anyone. No movement, no signs of a person in distress. I made the decision to descend. If someone was calling for help, even in this bizarre manner, I had a responsibility to investigate. I located a trail that switched back down the canyon wall and started the descent, calling out periodically to help guide me toward whoever was down there. Each time I called out, the voice would respond. Kendricks, this way. Kendricks, keep coming. Always in my own voice, always from a direction that seemed to shift as I moved deeper into the canyon. After about 20 minutes of hiking down the trail, I reached the canyon floor. The voice had continued calling intermittently, but now it seemed to be coming from deeper in the canyon system, away from the main trails. I followed a dry creek bed in the direction the voice seemed to indicate, moving carefully over loose rocks and around boulders. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side of me, and the late afternoon sun was starting to create deep shadows. I continued to radio dispatch with updates on my position, though my radio signal was getting weaker as I moved deeper into the canyon. The voice led me to a narrow side canyon, a slot that split off from the main drainage. The entrance was maybe 8 feet wide, and the walls quickly narrowed as the passage wound into the rock. I hesitated. Entering narrow slot canyons alone is generally a bad idea, especially when following an unidentified voice that sounds like your own. But the voice called again from inside the slot. Kendricks, in here. I turned on my flashlight and entered the narrow passage. The slot canyon was claustrophobic, with walls that closed in to barely shoulder width in places. I moved slowly, checking my footing on the uneven floor and using my hands against the walls for balance. The passage twisted and turned, and after maybe 50 yards, I emerged into a small chamber, a natural cavity in the rock about 15 feet across. The voice had been leading me here, but the chamber was empty. No person, no signs of recent human presence, just bare rock and sand. I stood there trying to make sense of the situation, and then my radio crackled to life. Not with dispatch, with my own voice. My voice coming through the radio speaker calling my name. Kendricks. I grabbed the radio and checked the frequency. It was set to the correct channel. I keyed the mic and demanded to know who was on the frequency and what their location was. The response was my own voice, played back through the radio, not repeating my question, just saying Kendricks over and over. I left the chamber quickly, moving back through the narrow slot canyon toward the main drainage. The voice followed me. Sometimes it came from behind me, echoing through the slot. Sometimes it came from ahead, as if someone was waiting at the exit. And sometimes it came from the radio, broadcasting impossibly on the Ranger frequency. I reached the open canyon floor and started back toward the trail that would take me up to the rim. The sun was getting lower, and I wanted to be out of the canyon before dark. As I climbed the switchback trail back toward the rim, the voice continued. But now it was not just calling my name, it was saying other things. Fragments of conversations I had had earlier that day. Phrases from my radio check-ins with dispatch. Comments I had made to hikers I had encountered. All in my voice. All played back, as if someone had been recording me throughout the day and was now replaying it. The effect was deeply unsettling. I reached the rim trail and headed back toward the ranger station, moving faster than I normally would. The voice continued even on the rim, now seeming to come from down in the canyon depths. My name, random phrases, sometimes full sentences that I recognized as things I had said days or weeks earlier, as if every word I had ever spoken in this canyon had been recorded and stored somewhere and was now being played back to me. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun had set. I filed a report of the incident with my supervisor, describing what I had experienced, but acknowledging that I had not found any person in distress or any explanation for the voice. My supervisor listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he pulled a file from his desk. It contained reports from 3 other rangers dating back to 2015, all describing similar experiences, all reporting hearing their own voices calling to them from the canyon, all following the voice to the same narrow slot canyon and finding nothing. The supervisor explained that the Park Service had quietly documented these incidents but had not publicized them because there was no explanation and no apparent danger. No ranger had been harmed. No visitors had reported similar experiences. It seemed to be a phenomenon that only affected rangers who spent significant time in the canyon, specifically in the eastern section where I had been patrolling. He said the working theory, such as it was that the unique acoustic properties of that section of canyon somehow captured and replayed sounds in ways that were not fully understood. But he also acknowledged that the theory did not adequately explain what we were experiencing. I requested a reassignment to a different patrol area after that incident. I still work at Palo Duro Canyon, but I avoid the Eastern Rim Trail. I have seen the narrow slot canyon marked on maps, and I have noticed that it is not included in any official trail guides or visitor information. The area is not restricted exactly, but it is not promoted or maintained either. A quiet acknowledgement that something about that place is not quite right. I have researched the geological history of that section of canyon and found nothing unusual. The rock formations are the same as everywhere else in Palo Duro. The acoustic properties should be no different. But I have also learned that the slot canyon and surrounding area were considered sacred by the Plains Apache who inhabited this region centuries ago. According to what limited information I could find, they believed the canyon was a place where the boundaries between the physical world and the spirit world were thin, and that voices of ancestors could be heard echoing through the rocks. Whether there is a connection between those traditional beliefs and what modern rangers experience, I cannot say. But I know what I heard, and I know I was not alone in experiencing it. The canyon holds sounds that should not exist, and plays them back in ways that should not be possible. And somewhere in that narrow slot In a small chamber carved from red rock, something listens and remembers every word spoken in its presence. I have not been back, and I have no intention of returning. Some echoes are not meant to be answered.